what Senator Sullivan has put together in Alaska during the August working period as well. Many of the solutions that Mr. Sullivan will discover, create, demand during that conversation will help hard-to-connect states like mine. And I want to thank him for that. And we're going to be watching closely because we want them in New Mexico next. So
Good.
I appreciate that, Senator
Thank you, Mr.
Sullivan.
Chairman. I'll give you a readout.
I appreciate that, sir. We'll conclude the hearing. There's a few things I wanted to ask based on the conversation that we already had. So with your indulgence, I hope not to go on more than 5 to 10 minutes. I want to follow up where Senator Sullivan concluded his questioning, Mr. Bonhomme, with the GAO reports. As I stated earlier, I do plan on introducing into the record 2 of the reports that were produced by the GAO on the urgent need of improvement with coordination and the planning process for federal spectrum management. So we'll work with you to get that done. I would agree with the testimony here today that the updated Memorandum of Understanding on Spectrum Coordination is real progress, but the work is just beginning, and I think that needs to be emphasized. While there's a good signature here, a good agreement on paper, how this will be implemented and how the agencies will work together will be watched by all. And I think there was complete bipartisan agreement on every aspect said about that. So I know our friends are listening and watching. Won't be surprised if any of them are in the room today. I want to ensure both agencies, the FCC and the NTIA, are empowered to prioritize the public's interest first in spectrum discussion as well, and how we get there. That's building off of the question that our chair asked, specific to the needs and allocations. Also, Senator Klobuchar asked, specific to some of these programs on how they should be prioritized, as did, I'm going to get now in trouble with Senator Hickenlooper and Senator Markey, with families and communities across the country that did not have connectivity during the most recent health scare that the country experienced with COVID, but we should anticipate other needs down the road. And with the promise of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which says that 100% of the country will be connected, I hope that will be proven true, in that 100% of the country will be connected. And your expertise is going to be needed to help provide that guidance and answer questions during the implementation. Now, GAO's mission here is critical, and I appreciate your ongoing work to provide Congress with fact-based, nonpartisan information that can help improve federal government performance and ensure accountability for the benefit of the American people. And you're going to hear us going back to you quite a bit and to the GAO. Now, Ms. Baker, in your testimony, you advocate for promoting the administrator of NTIA to the position of undersecretary. Can you quickly explain why that's important as a step going forward for everyone to consider?
I think it gives a number of different reasons, and thanks for the question. As an undersecretary, you're at a higher level. If you're dealing with a cabinet member and you're an assistant secretary, the imbalance is already there. So I think elevating the NTIA would help show the authority that this Congress believes that they should have in adjudicating federal spectrum disputes.
I appreciate that, Ms. Baker. And there's some consistency here as well with recommendations that came out of the GAO as well. And again, I think this is an important area for everyone to pay attention, especially everyone that's been frustrated when something breaks down. It could be as simple as ensuring that someone that's at the table is truly respected by those that are doing work with them. And so I very much appreciate that awareness as well. Mr. Lewis, from your testimony, I think you'll agree that first and foremost, our priority must be to put the SCARE resource to work for all Americans, and I would emphasize all Americans. It's Congress's job to determine which solution will ultimately serve the public interest. And so in this discussion, I want to stress one thing, is that public safety must remain a priority. The importance of looking at safe and reliable communication networks, ensure public safety professionals like firefighters, law enforcement, and medical professionals to do their job. In my state, like we do in many other states, we have a terrible problem with missing and murdered Indigenous people. Someone that may have a mobile device on them, but cannot make a 911 call to be found. A last text that may save their life. Solutions to triangulate where that person was the last time that they may have pinged off a tower, which could save their life. This issue is finally and these families are finally getting the attention of the federal government in a way that should have been there from day one without question. When I say public safety, especially with the fires that we are seeing now in New Mexico, which were started by the federal government, in this case, a controlled burn that got out of control. I'm told it's a very low percentage, but nonetheless, that low percentage started 2 fires in our state recently that cost people their homes. And now we're seeing flooding in those communities that are costing people their lives. With that being said, how can Congress best ensure the need of public safety are prioritized when developing national spectrum policy?
There are a number of ways, Senator. Certainly, the investment of dollars in Next Generation 911 as a public interest value is one that we've highlighted today. An emphasis on resiliency, and thank you for your leadership on the resiliency of communications networks. We need to continue to emphasize that so that during natural disasters and other emergency situations, folks can trust that the networks will be available. But also, when we're talking about spectrum policy, the importance of setting the rules for prioritization on the network. We talked about the success of the CBRS ban, which has tiers of access prioritization, but making sure that emergency communications and other public safety are prioritized, especially in when those emergencies happen, I think is an important priority.
Now, as part of that, Mr. Lewis, outside of spending proceeds, your testimony pointed to something that caught my attention, and that was with enhanced competition and incentive program that some folks will refer to as E-CHIP. Now, the chair of the FCC, Chair Rosenworcel, has highlighted how this program aims to promote greater competition and increase access to advanced wireless services in rural and tribal communities. How can Congress expand on E-CHIP to better promote competition?
Senator, I think a simple mandate to extend the same concepts and values that we saw with the recent decision on ESIP at the FCC would go a long way. This is the idea of partitioning off spectrum, incentivizing licensed users to licensed services to partition off that spectrum so that communities that don't have access can use it when they're not using it. We've talked about build-out requirements, and that can lead to partitioning or sharing opportunities. So we just need to enshrine that further into the rules on other spectrum bands.
I appreciate that. And while there's a more robust conversation taking place with an injection of money like we've never seen in the United States to connecting the country, this is going to be critical if, in fact, assumptions that have been made that still will not connect 100% of the country in states that are hard to connect states where some of those challenges exist with topography and geography, this is an area that could provide some solutions. I very much appreciate your attention there. Mr. Van Am, one area that's received a lot of attention from myself, being proud to represent a state with many Pueblo and tribal communities, especially pointing to the 2.5 gigahertz auction as well. One of the questions that I have based on conversations with different leaders and those that have been hired responsible for this work is that sometimes given the short timeline and build-out requirements, there's challenges for connection and adoption. And with the promise of what 2.5 gigahertz means for connectivity for some of the issues I've already raised, what recommendation does GAO have for Congress to ensure tribes can take advantage of similar programs in the future?
Thanks for that question, Senator. There's a recent report that I think is germane here that we issued in July where we looked at tribal broadband issues and looked at all the federal programs that could support deployment of broadband on tribal lands. But let me start by saying that the tribal priority window is a great idea. It had hundreds of tribes who really don't have access to spectrum, were able to get licenses. And for many of them in the work that we've done, the frustration has been that they got the license, but they didn't get any funding along with it. And so they had to sort of figure out what to do with it, and with sort of looming build-out requirements and timeframes associated with that license. The federal programs that could support that broadband infrastructure, they all have their own timeframes in terms of the ability for tribes to apply for it. And a number of the tribes that got the license are ones where they don't necessarily have their own telco that serves the tribal lands, or they don't have a utility that could be that, or they don't have their own wireless network at this point. And so they're hoping for this spectrum to be able to create that new wireless network. So they have a reliance on whether it be a local telco or consultants to help them figure out how to build this network. And so our recommendations really were trying to focus on the way to leverage federal programs and federal investment here to address the kinds of problems that you see and the barriers you see on tribal lands. We made a recommendation to the Executive Office of the President to include a tribal focus in a national broadband strategy that we've recommended that they develop. And we also made recommendations to the Department of Commerce and NTIA in their Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth to bring tribal issues to bear in their ongoing coordination efforts with federal agencies across all of these different broadband programs. So that's hopefully those have at least makes some headway into this very important issue, because those lands do fall behind in terms of connectivity across the country.
It's my hope that several committees will show interest in this particular area, especially given the challenges that we know that exist, and with infrastructure challenges still in front of the tribes with easement approvals, things of that nature. This is another area where getting that connectivity and being able to provide that support to more families will help us connect more people. So I very much appreciate that. I do have a question on the timeline with the House bill, and I'm hoping to get a perspective from every one of the panelists that's able to answer this. 18 months was a time period that was included in the House authorization bill, and what I heard from some of my colleagues today is that that is a position that they support. But I also heard from my colleagues that said that they do not want to see spectrum expire. They don't want to see this authorization go away. So as we all work together, my question, I'll start with you, Mr. Lewis, is even though I've heard your advocacy loud and clear, is are you open to a longer period than 18 months as this conversation moves forward and legislation is put together? I hope to pass before September 30th.
Definitely open. You heard my preference for a permanent authority, but yeah, the longer the authority, the better. I think it sends the right signal that we're looking for a multi-sector win here for all stakeholders to be at the table and to be at the table in determining what the spectrum rules and spectrum pipeline looks like.
I appreciate that. Ms. Baker?
18 months has been agreed to by the House. I like it. I think it makes some sense it makes sense to keep the stakeholders at the table so that we can have a long-term spectrum pipeline, which is really going to be important. As you have a short-term extension to a longer extension, the longer extension really needs to have specific bands attached to it. I think 18 months is about right. I'm not married to 18 months, so we could certainly see something else work there.
I'll fixate on the latter. So not married to 18 months, that's room for growth.
Yes, but we want to make sure that we get a spectrum pipeline. It's important for our global competitiveness. So we want to make sure people don't move on to another problem and don't focus on the fact that we've got to get a spectrum pipeline, and it's going to take a lot of work.
I appreciate it. So I don't want to misstate what I fixated on. So open to a longer period as long as partners are at the table and having a conversation about what would be included as part of that.
Right, that is correct.
Okay.
When you have a longer-term spectrum pipeline, which we shouldn't wait too long, I'd like to see one in the next year because the rest of the globe is moving forward on 5G, and we need to get our path. But 18 months, longer than 18 months, 2 years, yes, that's fine.
Or longer?
But let's see what we can do.
All right, I'll leave it at that. I'll stop pushing. I very much appreciate that answer. That means a lot. Thank you. Mr. Van Oom.
Yeah, so I don't think we would have any, and we certainly think reauthorizing spectrum auction authority is very important. I mean, we would only say that we believe that whatever spectrum is decided on in terms of reallocation should go through the existing processes that we have in place that NTIA, FCC, and the federal agencies are involved in determining what spectrum can be reallocated effectively.
Appreciate it. So, Dr. Bazelon, you're no longer at GAO. So I'm
CBO.
hoping, sorry, CBO. So I hope that we won't get a similar answer here, if you will. But what are your thoughts here?
I'll try. Thank you. We need long-term auction authority. We also need a spectrum pipeline. If 18 months is the only way you're going to get the focus of attention to do the work to get the spectrum pipeline, then that's a trade-off that's worth considering. But it does come with some cost. An 18-month authority creates the problem for the FCC and the NTIA that they don't have the authority to plan past that. They can't contract beyond 18 months without that authority. So it does throw some sand in the gears a little bit, but if it ultimately serves the purpose of getting the bigger work of a pipeline together, then maybe that's a trade-off worth considering.
I appreciate that. That may be where my head is, the latter part of the response, which is this is tough. This isn't easy policy. It can be messy at times. And what I've heard from everyone, all stakeholders that I've had the chance to speak to, is what certainty provides and what long-term deals may be in place, but also in planning. Given the bipartisan infrastructure bill, where we are with the work that still is happening on existing authorizations, the question that I still have as well is, well, what does that mean come September 30th? Does the authority allow it to continue based on work they're doing, or what happens then? And I hope we get an answer to that soon. I'm pointing to the smart people behind me. But because of the challenges on that timeline, that's where my head is. And also understanding the work that was done in years past when I was a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and on the sub, and work that has continued with colleagues that I now serve with here. And there's a difference of opinion, which always means, well, how do you work together? And if there's a willingness to try to find that, given the right inclusion to what this may mean to prevent a September 30th expiration, I know that I'm speaking in this perfect world, but nonetheless, that's how I operate. I'm an optimist. And in the same way that we had a very respectful hearing today, you have a lot of people that are interested here. And so how can everyone work together to include these ideas, but so we can get something adopted? I certainly don't want to see a world where September 30th comes and goes, and then October comes and goes, and November comes and goes, and then December, and then everyone's saying, oh, well, don't worry, this will be done in the new year. That's the worst thing that we could do. And by the way, let's get a fifth FCC commissioner while we're at it. But I know that may be more divisive than what I'm asking for on spectrum reauthorization, oddly enough. But I'm hopeful that we can get there and that we can have a full operating commission. We can get spectrum reauthorization. We can move down the road in a way that optimizes how people are going to get connected in the country. And then one last cleanup. I wasn't anticipating bringing this up, but since it was an area of emphasis by several of my colleagues, this is back to you, Ms. Baker. There was some question about changes in the tax law. And the question was asked such that, will your members get hurt? And I know I'm paraphrasing here, but not all of the members would feel that change, would they? The 15%? I can ask it a different way. It's my understanding that companies that have $1 billion in profit, not revenue, but profit, are those that would be included in the provisions that were discussed by several of our colleagues and being looked at with impact to them.
So are you saying, is your question, are the smaller carriers not impacted by this? Is this a larger spectrum holding issue? Carriers
that do not make $1 billion in profit.
I find that any retroactive tax on this critical infrastructure input, it doesn't seem like the right policy for building out broadband to the rest to all of America.
I appreciate that, but since the question was pointed by my colleagues, and it's my understanding, and I can pull the language here, is that it would impact for-profit companies with $1 billion in profit. that's where that 15% would be levied there and up. With that being said, you're put 220, 230 members, if I have my math right, or if I looked at the website correctly. Based on my look at the website, 6 or 7 major telecommunication companies that have exceeded 1 billion in profits, one that didn't post a profit, that is a member back in 2020. But nonetheless, that's my understanding of how this would get hit. I'm just looking for that clarification, because one of the questions was asked such that when I heard the response, it felt like everyone would get hit by the 15%. And I'm just looking to clarify the record that way.
My expert says you are correct. As to my assumption is that we're looking at those that are building broadband nationwide. So that would be a smaller subsect.
I appreciate that.
But I'm also happy to get back to you on more information on that.
I look forward to hearing more, and we can submit something into the record so that we provide you an opportunity to respond to that. And I understand clearly what you are saying in that the 5 or 6 that I've identified, there may be others that exceed that they provide coverage all over the country. But I will make sure we submit that so that way you get a chance to be able to answer that thoroughly as well.